this year's Purim has fallen to be on Erev Shabbat, and it begs the question of when is the best time and the best way to have Seudat Purim, because obviously we realize that on a regular Erev Shabbat it's prohibited to have a large Seudah in the afternoon, because we want to go to Shabbat with a proper appetite. We want to enter Shabbat in a way that we have appetite for the Seudah. Actually, the Mishnah Berurah writes in Chol Shabbat in the beginning of Chelek Gimel that he's against having kiddushes on Shabbat morning in the shul, because if you're not yotze the Seudah with the kiddush in the Bet Knesset, because you're not eating bread, even though that's kiddush b'makom Seudah, but you're not actually having bread, so then you carve your appetite, and by the time you come home, forget about all the hashkafik and shalom bayit and all that, but you get home, for the Seudah you have no appetite. And therefore, you're transgressing this takana of Chazal that was to not eat and to enter the Seudah of Shabbat when you are ra'ev, when you are hungry. Now, this could be challenged by when you have a Seudat mitzvah. Seudah Gdolah is a large Seudah Shabbat afternoon is always a challenge. But you have a Seudat mitzvah, maybe it's a little better. But at the same time, it becomes complicated, because especially if you follow those poskim who don't require having bread for Seudah of Purim, which is not the chiyuv Seudah necessarily. So if you ate something in the morning, some steak and some wine, to just start yourself off, so maybe you're already very yotze with that, and having a Seudah afterwards in the afternoon would become a bigger challenge, because now what's your heter to have that Seudah? You can't have two Seudas necessarily. If one of them is going to be sufficient, the second one is going to be probably asur, because you're having a large Seudah on an Erev Shabbat, which is going to carve your appetite for Seudat Shabbat. So therefore, there are two ways that would be halachically advisable for people to do in this year, to make a long story short and encapsulate the main point without the details, would be lechatchila to do a Seudah in the morning. If a person could do Seudah in the morning, the Kaf HaChaim in Siman Resh Ayin Aleph really advocates on behalf of this, that al pi Kabbalah anyways, a person should have a Seudah in the morning and stay away from having a later Seudah, especially in such a case. Now, there are many who advised or codified a minhag to be, like what the Gemara says in Masechet Pesachim, pores mapa umekadesh, that because it is difficult to have a Zera Emet rights. It says, imagine a regular Purim, we do it in the afternoon because there's mitzvah b'shlach manot and matanot l'havyonim, and people are running around the whole day. Imagine now, added to that is also the concept of preparing for Shabbat Seudah, which back in the day, without fridges and without the shopping abilities that we have nowadays, you had to really prepare everything on Erev Shabbat. So it's understandable why people would do this. They would come, start their Seudah in the evening of Purim, and kind of like would run into the daven early mincha, would start the Seudah, and then when it would become time for Shabbat, they would stop. They would do Kabbalat Shabbat and so on, or to say Kiddush. Now, even if you had wine before, so you don't say Bor Geffen, but say Birkat Kiddush. And Hamotzi you don't have to say, because you already washed on the Seudah of Purim. So kind of like the Seudah of Purim would run into Seudat Shabbat, and they would say Kabbalat Shabbat and Arvit at some point after that. So that's Pores Mapau Mekadesh. Now, this has its own challenges as well, because first of all, the nature of Seudat Purim being that a person is drinking wine. Again, as we mentioned before, it's more important to drink than to eat bread. And drinking wine poses a question halachically for a person that wants to daven. The Shulchan Aruch says in Siman Tzadit Tzif Aleph that a person that drinks even a mere revi'it of wine, now not differentiating between the wine back then and wine that we have nowadays, pashtut, a revi'it of wine, 3 ounces, give and take of wine, would render you a concept of quote unquote shatui. Even though that you're not shikor, you're not drunk, but you're considered a person that has drank enough wine that would not be able to properly daven. If you daven b'di'evet, your tefillah is still valid. But more than revi'it, it could become even a much bigger challenge. If you become shatui and shikor, then the tefillah could be really questionable if it's a valid tefillah, even b'di'evet, depending on how drunk a person has become. And the Chafetz Chaim writes there that it's not just a revi'it of wine, it's equivalent of that level of alcohol. So if you're taking in alcoholic beverages that are 40% or more, it's a contest of how much alcohol you could drink. And every year people bring to me, this past year someone had something with 72, I don't remember exactly, 70 some percent alcohol. It's like fire going down your throat. If you have something like 40%, half a shot glass of that is more than enough for a person to become considered shatui. And then davening arvit obviously would become a problem. So that's something to keep in mind, and people should discuss it with their moreh hora'ah of how to go about that. The second challenge is if you're now eating Seuda afterwards and benching at the end, so what are you going to say? According to both Shulchan Aruch and the Rama in this case, you would have to mention Shabbat because you're eating afterwards, right? Having a start that, even according to the Rama, according to Shulchan Aruch, you go after the beginning of Seuda. According to the Rama, it depends if you had some bread afterwards. So according to both of them, you would have to say Shabbat, and you can't say Shabbat and Purim together because that's oxymoron. That's the stira. It's either Friday or it's Shabbat. So therefore, it becomes a problem. Chacham Ovadia, the tshuva that was printed after he passed away in Chelek Yud Aleph, he has a tshuva that he says if you're doing already the afternoon Seuda, so you should bench. Don't do pores mapa. Bench, and then do your, after Birkat Hamazon, you could do your Kabbalat Shabbat, Arvit, and all that, and start a new Seuda, a brand new Seuda with. Now, that has its own problems as well, because if you're in the same place, you have to have a proper halachic hefsek. This the Magen Avraham and others discuss in the change of Seudot on Shavuot morning. For the Seuda of Shavuot, that people try to have milchik and fleshik together, milchik to satisfy the midrash, that it was devash v'chalav tachal l'shonech, and all the other reasons of having milchik and Shavuot. And at the same time, you want to have en simcha ela basar v'yayin, Seudat Yom Tov. You want to have samachta b'chagecha, even though the Shulchan Aruch doesn't even bring the chiyuv of basar, but nevertheless, that's l'chatchila what people want to do. Shulchan Aruch does bring the chiyuv of wine. You have to have a revit of wine every Seuda of Yom Tov, so you have to find the wine that goes with cheese, But nevertheless, people want to have meat, especially in the Seuda of Yom Tov morning. The Dr. Tshuva says that's because Basar Shlamim, the Korban was in the morning, and so on. So therefore, you want to have, and people exchange. They start with the milchik Seuda, then they take the table off and bench, and then go around the block or say learn, and then start the second part of the Seuda, but it has to be a halachic hefsek. So if you're not davening arvit and doing Kabbalat Shabbat in the middle, it becomes a question to just separate and bench and start another Seuda. And if you are doing that, so then you have to deal and contend with the fact that you may be tipsy enough that it will be considered shatui, it's asur to daven. So there's no real perfect solution for that unless you really have your mind on it. For communal Seuda, it's very difficult to keep an eye on that. A private citizen that's doing it, it's much easier to keep a tab on it. And that basically indicates that even though that, for instance, Rabbi Aaron ben Shimon, in the author of Shara Mafkir, the Nar Mitzrayim, he says that in Yerushalayim that was kind of like the Nahug, what they did in this case, and apparently in Mitzrayim as well. Even though the Maharikash really in Erech Lechem brings that two different minhagim in Mitzrayim. How was it? It says Hakol Lefi minhag. It does not encourage any of them versus the other one. But the halacha l'maaseh would be lachatchila. A person should early on leave enough room, especially if you're not having any Seuda in the morning. You start your Seuda before Chatzot, if you could. Nowadays we could do the mishloach manot and all that from before. The preparations for Shabbat could be already in fridge from before. If you could manage the time and start from before Chatzot, the Seuda, and that would be the only Seuda you have, nothing beforehand, and then you bench. You have enough time to take a nap as well, and then you enter Shabbat properly with Bigdei Shabbat, not with a costume and so on. That would be the Chatchila, but otherwise, certainly the Eitzah of Pores Ma'apah Mekadesh, in a way that Chacham Ovadia says it, will be a viable, legitimate thing as well. Better to say the benching. Don't drink enough that you can't daven properly, and then you could start with that Shabbat afterwards as well. Again, just setting off some alarms for people to ask questions from their local Moreh Hora'ah for what would be the best idea, best advice for their family. Have a wonderful day and Purim Sameach.